No, we're fine.
Okay, sounds good.
The recording has started.
Okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's webinar, which is Legislative Advocacy and New Cannabis Laws. We have three main goals tonight. First, we want to teach about how cannabis laws are made, the mechanics of how the law is actually made, because that's really important to being in the cannabis industry and making sure you understand how to navigate and advocate for yourself. And then the second purpose tonight is to summarize new cannabis law proposals. I can tell you now that it's going to be a very, very, very short portion because I have created a very helpful chart that we shared in our community education email that details a lot of the recent proposals. And so if you don't have that, just drop us a note at cannabis@thetrepschool.com and we can figure out how to get you access to that, because that has the more detailed information, which I'll discuss again later. And then our third goal tonight is to get into a really cool guest panel. All of these esteemed individuals are extraordinarily skilled at legislative advocacy, and they have been out at the forefront of it in this state doing amazing work. And I'm super excited to have them all here, and I'll introduce them shortly. All right, so you have our moderator, Tricia Teague, who is our CEO over here at the Trep School. I love working with her. Everyone who knows me and knows Tricia, that we are two peas in a pod. We enjoy working together quite a bit, and we've come together to really do a lot of work in the technical assistance space with working with social equity applicants. I'm S.L. Owens. I'm an attorney, a first-generation attorney. I grew up on Chicago's West Side in the Austin neighborhood, so I'm extremely familiar with the devastation caused by the war on drugs. And I'm so happy to be back here at home, working with so many amazing and diverse advocates in this space. And we're all just like doing the thing. And so I feel extremely blessed to be here with you all in this space. I am now CannaTrep's Chief Cannabis Officer over here, leading all of our technical assistance in the cannabis space. So CannaTrep is a new phenomenon, really, especially in the state as well as in the national space around a law and business clinic, merging those skill sets into one umbrella to serve social equity applicants in this state. So we're funded by the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. And so I just want to say right off the bat, the views expressed tonight in this presentation, they do not represent the IDCEO, or they do not represent the state of Illinois. So just want to put that out there. But I do want you all to know that we do receive funding to do this great work that we do with you. I'll also like to put another notice out there. We are not a law firm. We are an educational services company. So the presentation tonight, this is not legal advice. Please hire an attorney for legal advice. Use this as educational content, but also understand that the laws in this area are constantly changing based on legislation, based on regulation changes, and based on litigation. And so what I'll say is the information I'm presenting tonight is as current as this month. But tomorrow things could change and we could be doing another webinar giving you updates. So our agenda tonight, we have 3 parts going on. First, I will start by walking everyone through how Illinois cannabis law is made. Then we'll move to part 2, where I'll give you a very quick primer on new Illinois cannabis law proposals, because our legislative session, that's a mouthful, just started again this week around, I believe, January 13th. So things are happening right now. Then we'll take a brief break and do a survey that I would like to encourage you all to take. It will just take a few minutes of your time on break so that we can continue to advocate for funding to do the work that we do here tonight. And then we will have our guest panel, and we have some amazing guests from Illinois Equity Staffing, Cannabis Equity Coalition. I call them the coalition. I know a lot of folks call them the coalition. When they join us later, they can further introduce themselves, and Chicago Normal. So that's pretty exciting. So let's jump into it. Matter of fact, before we jump into it, I am going to take questions as I go. So if you have questions, especially about the technical aspects of how cannabis law is made, or questions about how to approach reading law, all of those things are in my wheelhouse. So definitely feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A. And my sister Tricia is going to moderate and get those questions to me periodically throughout the presentation. So first, let's start here with the law, because one of the things about cannabis law is because of federal prohibition, it's a state by state thing. There at the federal level, cannabis is still unlawful. And so one of the ways to think about approaching it is on a state by state basis. And so tonight we're really focused on what's going on here in Illinois. And really there are two buckets to think about. And that first bucket is state law. And so in this bucket, you have the legislative branch, you have the executive branch, and you have the judicial branch. And so at the legislative branch, those are our elected politicians that we send to Springfield here. They make what's called statutory law, and we're going to walk through that some shortly. And that's all of our Illinois legislators. Then we have the executive branch, and they make what's called administrative law, also known as regulatory law, sometimes also called compliance law in the legal field. And this is important to understand because I would say two big opportunities for learning for social equity applicants that I saw in the last few years was people didn't really understand how cannabis law was made. And so they didn't have an opportunity to participate in any of the processes. And then number two, the part that folks didn't realize existed was the administrative law portions of this. So people would understand the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. They would know that they needed to look at the CRTA, but they didn't necessarily recognize that they also needed to look at the agency rules. That's called administrative law. And so I'm going to walk through that today because you can be involved in both of those processes as those laws and rules are being made. And then the third bucket over here is the judicial branch. And as many of us have seen, that is a huge way in which cannabis law is shaped and made at the state level right now. And so you can have the legislators make laws, you can have the agencies make rules, and then you'll have the judicial branch make what's called case law. And that could end up superseding and trumping any administrative law or statutory law that has been made. And then you have this other bucket, and that's the local law, right? And that's the law that's made by municipalities. So we're talking cities, suburbs, town, think Cook County, think City of Chicago. They also are involved in the process. And that's another level in which you can be involved in legislative advocacy is at the local level, understanding a huge buzz topic in the area of cannabis right now, zoning, consumption, licensing, policing practices around cannabis, because although it is legalized, we still exist in an era where there is still a huge war on drugs going on, even in the era of state legalization. And so you still have Black and brown folks being disproportionately impacted by arrest, even under legalization regimes. And a lot of those decisions are often being made at the local and the municipal level. And so if you're really thinking about how cannabis law is made, the first thing to think about are these two main areas that it's happening in within the state. It's happening at this greater state level, and it's happening in three branches of government, which are supposed to be checks and balances to each other, right? So if the legislator makes something that is unconstitutional, you have the judicial branch there to be a check to that. If the executive branch makes any rules at the agency level that is considered to be unconstitutional, for example, then you have the legislator there being able to pull those powers back, because the legislator is who gives them power. And you also have the judicial branch there to pull them back when they're going too far or not going in the right direction. And then you have this other bucket of local law happening in every single county and every single city and all of the jurisdictions throughout the state. So even if you think about this from social equity, we have social equity laws at the state level, but that doesn't mean we couldn't be advocating to have social equity laws at the county level, at the city level. For example, I said I grew up in Austin. Hey, CPD, They participated in the war on drugs. They, participated in that. And so perhaps the city of Chicago could have its own social equity programs the same way the state does. Same thing with Cook County, the sheriff's department, the prosecutor's office, all of those institutions have participated in the war on drugs. And so perhaps they also could be doing some restorative work and creating laws to push the ball forward on social equity. Tricia, do we have any questions coming in before I move to the next slide?
No, not yet.
Okay. And so our focus tonight will be on the state level. I am not going to dig into municipal law, right? Because as you can see, it's a lot to chew on there. So, and we can have further, like if when you do the survey tonight, if you're like, hey, I would love to do a webinar that was just legislative advocacy on the municipal level, something Tricia and I have talked about, particularly around thinking about some of the zoning issues that folks are facing right now, we'd be happy to put together some programs like that. But that's a huge scope. We need to separate some of this out. So tonight we're really just going to focus on Illinois state law and how law is made at that level. And if you think about it, because of federal prohibition, the state really is the umbrella sort of legal institution, legal system, and everything else is kind of trickling down from there anyway. So this is a good place to start in terms of understanding how it's made. And also, this is the legal institution, the state of Illinois, who regulates the licensing process for cannabis businesses. As of right now, the municipalities haven't really been getting into doing that type of licensing, but we will eventually see that, especially around consumption and things like that. You'll, I think, begin to see some license categories broken off in that kind of way. So let's take a step back and look at the legal system here. So we're thinking about the legislative branch as one system, and then we're going to think about the judicial branch as another system, and we'll also look at the executive branch as another system. And when I say executive branch, I mean those state agencies. So think Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulations, Illinois Department of Agriculture. Those are the two that most people kind of learn about first in the industry, but there are more than a dozen Illinois agencies involved in cannabis law in this state. And that's before we get to local jurisdictions. And that's important to know because not every state is organized like that in terms of having the law and the regulations spread across so many agencies. There are jurisdictions that have these centralized cannabis regulation and regulatory regimes where there's really just one agency doing most or all things. And that's not how we do things in Illinois. We do things across multiple agencies. So when we look at the legislative branch, we're looking at Illinois legislators, and another word you all are seeing up here is Illinois lobbyists. And I won't get into a bunch of detail. I'll certainly take questions about lobbying law because that's its own beast. But I have it up here because you really can't think about Illinois legislators without thinking about the lobbyists because they kind of go hand in hand. And I'd be curious when we have our guest panel to certainly hear more of their thoughts on this as the people who are out in the field dealing with these issues. But what I will say from the legal perspective is that the lobbyists are down in Springfield using all of their might and their power to have laws made the way that their different interest groups want to see them made. And the same thing can happen for social equity and does happen for social equity in communities like the community I come from in Austin. Nothing stops any of us from also being able to lobby or get involved in the process of communicating with our legislators directly. And it certainly takes a lot of work, which is why I'm glad we have people here who do that so that they can answer questions and talk about what that looks like. But I do want to point out, I consider them to be a part of the legislative branch, an unofficial part of the legislative branch because they are so intimately involved. So they're making statutory law, and in regulated industries like cannabis, what that means is these are the laws that lawyers sometimes call chief legislation. And what we mean by that is that's the main law, body of law that has created the umbrella of rules and has created the framework for an area or an industry, and it has assigned responsibilities to agencies. So let's go back to IDFPR, the Illinois Department of Financial Professional Regulation, right? They don't just exist on their own. They can't, that's not how the legal system works. In order for them to exist, a chief law or a piece of legislation has to be passed by the legislator, and the legislator has to write in laws that make them exist. And then they have to write in laws that say what their duties are. So we couldn't just be like, we're going to form a new agency. It's going to be called the Social Equity Agency. Now we could, in theory, have an agency that's just like that if we, let's say, got with our legislators and said, we want a state agency just for social equity. But that can't exist without the legislator creating laws to make that agency exist. They don't exist on their own. They have to be made through the legislative process. Another way agencies can be made is through the executive branch. So the governor can create certain public bodies and things like that, committees and things, and things like that. So that's the second way that agencies can exist as well. But we just couldn't, as citizens, say, hey, we want to make an agency. It doesn't work like that. And so an example would be the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. That's the main piece of legislation that regulates the cannabis licensing process in the state of Illinois. And in that, if you read the CRTA, you will see tons of Illinois agencies listed in there, from the R3 program, which is our restorative justice grants, to Cannabis Business Development Fund, another process in there that funds technical assistance like what we're doing here tonight. And you'll see the agencies being assigned to those different funds to allocate those funds and to start those programs. And you'll see the legislator kind of drawing out what they want those agencies to do. And sometimes, most of the time, probably all the time, when you're dealing with new areas of law, many things are left unsaid in there. And so agencies are kind of left having to sort of figure those things out, particularly through what's called the rulemaking process. And so we'll get to that. That happens through the executive branch. And so in the executive branch, you have the agencies, IDFPR, for example, Illinois Department of Agriculture. And I keep using those because those are the main two agencies that are involved in the licensing process. But you have other agencies involved in cannabis. So if you're new to this space, understand these aren't the only two. You got Illinois State Police, you got the Department of Health, it's a ton of agencies involved in cannabis in Illinois. And then you have this third agency, which I think is often a very little known agency, and even within the lawyer community, a very little known, unless you practice regulatory law, you wouldn't really know this agency like that. And that is JCAR, the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules. So here's how it works. The legislator says, we want to create a piece of chief legislation on cannabis. So we create the CRTA, the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. In the CRTA, we are going to assign to the IDFPR to create application processes for dispensary licenses. Okay, let's use that as an example. They may say some more things, right? Like you were going to have social equity applicants. They're going to qualify this way and that way, that kind of thing. They're going to have a point system, and so forth. The next thing that happens in the legal process in terms of making law is IDFPR gets this piece of legislation and they're like, okay, the legislator gave us the responsibility and role of making the rules for creating dispensary licenses. So you have the legislator saying, we want IDFPR to be in charge of this procedure and process. Now IDFPR has to actually make that happen. They have to make an application process happen. And in order for them to do that, they have to go through what's called a rulemaking process. That is, in a nutshell, what administrative law is. It's the act of agency creating rules to fulfill the duties that legislators have assigned to them. So IDFPR says, let's make some rules. in their rulemaking process, they don't just get to make it up. They don't get to just say, okay, cool, I like this rule, what rule you like? They don't get to do that. What they are legally, what they're supposed to do is follow rulemaking laws and regulations, and those are really spelled out by JCAR. So if you go to the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules, JCAR's website, you will see JCAR has a very helpful little guide right at the front page of their website that you can click on that tells you how rulemaking works in the state of Illinois. And it walks you through how an agency has to do their drafting process, has to give notice to the public that they're engaging in rulemaking. They have to allow opportunity for the public to do comments on the rulemaking process, to give them, and we have to be able to give them a piece of our mind and say, hey, we think this is a good idea, this is not a good idea, here's a suggestion. And that's called a public comment in the rulemaking process. And to give you an example, recently they made new rules for a dispensary application social equity lottery to be happening through an online process, which is going to be coming up next week. We are doing a whole webinar on this next Thursday, so I'm not going to fully get into that process. I'll do that at our next webinar, but what I'll say today is, as it relates to how they made these rules, is they came up with a draft of the rules, and they gave an opportunity for the public to comment, right? And JCAR, they post all of this on their website. They post the drafts of the rules as they're coming in what's called the Illinois Register. And so they post them. And so over at TREP, and I saw public comments from other organizations, including those on our guest panel, like Illinois Equity Staff, and made a public comment. We made a public comment. And one of the comments we made was, hey, you guys have a 10-day application window, and you say this process is supposed to be for people who have been devastated by the war on drugs. We recommend that you revise that rule to make the application window longer. So that's an example of that. And sometimes agencies get those comments from the public, and they say, whoa, an overwhelming amount of people commented on this and said the application window is too short, and they change the language of the rule. Sometimes they don't, which is what happened in this case. They didn't change the language of the rule, but what they did do is they changed the actual action. And so instead of the next dispensary application window being 10 days to submit your application from when they post the application, I believe now it's going to be at least 30, like 30 something days. And so that's just an example of the good citizens of Illinois, us participating in the rulemaking process to make things in the social equity space more fair. And so if you don't know about JCAR, definitely get involved with JCAR and follow their process for how they make rules, because that's where the tedious stuff happens in the cannabis industry, really, because it's the agencies that are making the licensing process move along. All right, Tricia, any questions coming in? All right, I will keep it going here. And so the example I just gave was the social equity criteria lottery. And you can go on JCAR's website and look back in their notes from their meetings. And you can also look at what they call the Flynn report that they publish, which is a report that they publish, I believe, weekly every Friday, where they give a summary of all of the rules that are up for consideration so that people can participate in the rulemaking process. And then we have our judicial branch, and you won't see me complaining about it. I'm a lawyer. Hey, I don't have a problem with the judicial branch. And so we have the judicial branch, and how are they involved in the cannabis industry for folks that are new to the area? So the judicial branch, they decide whether these rules and laws created are fair. So they look at let's go back to Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, right? They may say, hey, one big issue that came up in the last year was whether having a category for veterans points was constitutional. Ultimately, the court system gets involved in deciding and determining and analyzing those types of legal issues and deciding whether they're going to do what's called strike laws down, which is really just lawyer speak for saying, legislator, go back to the board. You can't have a law like that. All right. Same thing for actions and rules that are done by Illinois agencies. So they'll look at the things that the IDFPR does. We just saw this in the last couple of years too. And they'll say, was the application process fair? Was the scoring fair? Was the point system fair? Was there the deficiency notice process fair? You know, these are all the things that the court system comes in and they begin to make case law that ends up becoming a part of cannabis law. Okay. We're still good, Tricia? No questions?
Still good, no question.
Okay. So just to recap, when you look at the making of the law and where you might want to fit into the process, at least at the state level, I think it's 3 different ways to look at it. So the first one, and one end of this, as you can see on this presentation, is a least adversarial way to get involved. And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is the most adversarial way to get involved. And so I would say getting involved in the legislative advocacy, and even though I'm sure, you know, the foot soldiers who are going to be on the panel may have, you know, way more ways to illuminate on this than me, because I'm only speaking from this from a the way legal systems are structured, but they're going to be speaking to this from what's called law in action. This is one thing for the laws to be written a certain way, but it's a whole other thing to be out there in the game getting things done. And so what I'm talking about is courts are just in the legal system considered to be the most adversarial process. So if you are bringing litigation, you are bringing lawsuits that are trying to strike down cannabis laws, that from just strictly legally speaking is considered more adversarial, the most adversarial. Whereas when you are lobbying legislator, advocating to the legislator, it's considered less adversarial than the other end of the spectrum. But please believe, I could imagine that Springfield feels extremely adversarial and a highly competitive industry with billions of dollars on the line and hundreds of years of harms done. So it's not that it's not adversarial on the legislative advocacy end, it's just that it's less adversarial, just strictly legally speaking, than the court system way of changing laws, because then you have to hire attorneys, go to court, litigate it, do discovery, file a bunch of complaints. That's a lot different than sort of being down in Springfield. Although I can imagine that it does feel pretty adversarial sometimes, or probably most of the time, to be in that space down in Springfield. And then the middle ground is really when you are involved in the rulemaking process at the agency level. And I say that's middle ground because agencies also have adversarial systems where they can be challenged on the decisions that they make in the rules that they apply and the processes that they do, including in the licensing process, right? Like if you get, for example, a deficiency notice, that is a pretty adversarial process in terms of you advocating for yourself that your application is not deficient. And there are often hearings and all types of other things that agencies have to make available when you have people's rights on the line that can begin to feel like court processes. So at the Illinois legislature level, I would say engaging them in session and following the process at minimum is something that you will want to be involved in this industry because it's just so highly competitive and there are so many harms that have been done, and there's also a lot of learning to be done as well. And then I would say on the Illinois agency side, you want to engage the rulemaking process and send public comments. This is as you can see, I'm a big fan of that middle ground, you know, and the reason why is because that rulemaking process, that's where like the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And I often find that lots of advocates miss that part of the process. And so that's a great place to also be engaged because that's where a lot of the tedious things happen for licensing processes. And then the next one is Illinois courts. And, you know, we've all seen enough about court systems either on TV or otherwise to know how litigious and adversarial that system can be. Tricia, I am checking in again. Are we good?
No, I mean, yes, we're good. And I was just gonna say, I think we had seen and I don't see it now, so I don't know if that was an accident or not, but just to say, if you do have a question, please type it in the Q&A box. And then that way, when SL checks with me, I can read it.
Okay. All right then, and so the next and very, very brief part of this is on new cannabis law proposals coming up in Illinois. And I would say this is a very brief summary. Please read the more detailed summary in our community education email. And if you have not received that and would like to start receiving those, you can contact us at cannabis@thetrepschool.com and we'll make sure you get access to it. So we're really seeing a lot of proposals in these three buckets right here. So we're seeing things related to transporters, and that's potentially pausing having new licenses come up in that category in order to give the current licensees a chance to grow and flourish. There are proposals around deferring fees for this category of license holders, and there are proposals around allowing them to share space with other CBE businesses, and that's cannabis business establishments for those who are new to the space. Then we have craft growers, and we're seeing proposals around expanding grow space, branding craft, like perhaps, you think about the craft beer movement, for example, and then it got really popular by a bunch of, really authentic craft folks. And then a bunch of other big beer companies came in and was like, we're craft too, just slap craft on the label. So that's what the thinking is there is, whether there should be rules around who can brand themselves as craft if you're not actually technically craft. And then there are proposals around expanding the number of licenses that can be held by owner. There are proposals around deferring taxes for these license holders, creating more licenses in the future, in the near future for this category of license holders, also sharing space between license holders here. And then for cultivators, there are proposals around creating required THC oil set-aside processes for infusers and sharing CBE space. And so I promised that this would be brief because, like I said, I put together a couple of pages of a nice, succinct chart that gets into more detail about some of these proposals. And I will stop again to ask Tricia, has anything come in, and to encourage you all to ask any questions you have for me right now before we move on.
No, there are no questions.
I was thinking that, hey, I'm like, hey, maybe there's no questions because I'm answering them as I go. All right, and so I would say the last thing that I would say in terms of thinking about how the law is made, if you are getting involved in the advocacy part of this, and you're just thinking about strictly like reading these rules and reading these laws, I think one area of growth for new advocates, especially if you are not a lawyer, is to look at some of the keywords around, I would start with like the who, what, when, and where questions. So if I'm reading a proposal, I'm like, so who, what, when, and where, like who's gonna be doing what? So who's bringing this forward, and what agencies are they assigning rules to? So that's a who and a what. When, what type of timeline? So if they're saying they're going to have new licenses or they're going to pause licenses, well, for how long and to when, or when will they start? The how, what are they saying about how this process or this licensing thing should go? And so that's just an example of like ways I would look at it. And then my second and last comment right now is I would also look at the difference in language between when the law or rule says something like shall versus must versus may, because that makes a big difference, for example, around what type of authority has been given to an agency. So if the legislator has instructed them that they shall or must do something versus they may do something, that's just something to think about in terms of reading legal proposals, law proposals. All right, So this is the moment where we're gonna take a break. And it is 6:40. So I would say, everybody, let's come back in 10 minutes at 6:50, and we will get started with our guest panel. If you can also on this break, do us the solid of completing a brief survey that should be in your email inbox. And it will be the email that you use to register for this event, where we would like you to just answer some questions about some of the services we do over here at TREP so that we can better serve you and keep serving you. All right? All right, thank you. I'll see everyone at 6:50.
So welcome back, everyone. So for this portion of the discussion, we're going to do our Q&A with the panelists. I believe we don't have any questions in the chat, but I believe that S.L. has a list of questions to get the conversation started. So I will turn things over to S.L. for her to go ahead and get the conversation started with the panelists. And then if, for those of you who are listening and watching, if you have any questions as they arise, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat box so that I can fill those questions and ask them to the panelists as we go throughout the session. S.L., you're muted.
Give me 1 minute here to get my presentation back up. All right now, so this is my favorite part today because I love learning from other stakeholders, and we have an awesome panelist ready to help us learn more about legislative advocacy. And so Tricia, what we're gonna do to start off everyone on the panel is I'm gonna do a quick icebreaker to help everybody introduce themselves. And so what I'll do is I will tell what the icebreaker question is and I will answer it so you all get a feel for it. Then I will pick somebody on the panel to introduce themselves and answer the icebreaker question. And then that person answering can throw it to somebody else and so forth. Is that cool? Tricia, do you want to do it too? I do want you to. You know I want you to. You know I'm spoiled. All right. So I'll start off. So the icebreaker question is, start off with, if you had to describe your advocate style as a color, what color would you choose and why? And I would say for myself as an advocate, and I've been an advocate in many different ways, as a litigator, then as a deal attorney, you know, I recovered litigator turned corporate, to a regulatory attorney. And so I would say that my advocate color is purple. And I pick purple because I always associate purple with the color of royalty. And I think of being an advocate as a role of being in service to others. And I pick purple also because I'm not quite a firecracker like a red, but I am kind of powerful and knowing, and I do have a presence in my style. And so I think purple sort of gets it for me. And so I'm going to pick the next person on our panel to answer, and I'm going to throw it to Peter.
Hey, good evening. Thank you again for having us. Yeah, purple was also going to be my answer. Purple is my favorite color. It's a very calming color. I think it's something that I try to be very calm and measured. Advocacy can be very emotional, especially being down in Springfield. And so I'm trying to be centered, but also purple is a mix of red and blue. And I don't really care who votes for our bills as long as they vote for it. So I'll take all the colors. I'll pass it over to Shawnee.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shawnee Williams. It's hilarious. My mentee that I've been assigned to for Illinois Women in Cannabis just texted me, and she knows apparently my color, and she's only been assigned to me in the last week and a half. Red, 100% red. I'm an Aries. I refuse. to be bothered, which is I will be the one that will be talking about my experience working with lobbyists, because I just can't do the personalities, nor can I do the egos. So 100% red, 1000% red. And I'm going to pass it to Kiana.
Oh, these are great colors. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to say gray. And that is because the advocacy and activism game is not black and white. It's so many shades of gray. And a lot of times what we have to do is to understand the nuances and then point them out and help the people, you know, on the street, you know, I call the street, and also the people in legislation. We have to help them understand the nuances and the shades of gray. I've very often find myself being like, okay, so now what's the other side of this? Or if something is just presented to us, I'm always trying to dig down and read between the lines and read behind to see what that message is and who benefits from giving that message. So I'm gonna say gray.
I would say green, not just because green is my favorite color, but also to me, green signifies growth and progress. And one of the reasons why I work in this space, which means why Trep works in this space, is because I just want to be able to see people grow and have the opportunities to be able to grow and you know, shift the culture and shift everything, you know, and shift the space. And so I think that's why my color is green. And so I guess I'll pass it back to S.L. to get us started. We do have some questions in the Q&A box, but I also know that you have questions as well.
Yes.
So,
and before I get started, what I'll say about the question portion is, to the extent that you have questions about the licensing categories, like if you have questions about the new licenses that are coming, applications that are coming up, I will tell you that's not our scope tonight. We are going webinar next week on the dispensary application, so definitely come there. But if you like, I really need these questions answered quickly, you can get an answer through our brief advising program on our website at www.CannaTrep.com, and we'd be happy to answer your questions to the extent they relate to licensing and they're not about legislative advocacy. So I just want to put that out there before we get started. And so I would say let's, Tricia, I'm gonna ask a question and then how about you pull one from the Q&A? How's that sound?
that sounds perfect.
Okay, because I think this will be helpful for folks. So if you guys don't mind, I wanted to start off by asking you, how did you get into this? How did you arrive to where you are a expert guest panelist, skilled, however you want to, classify yourself, a novice, but you're here in this space. How did you arrive here?
I can start. I stumbled into this space, so I arrived there totally by accident. There was a time when all we had in Illinois was the medical program. And, I found myself just kind of starting to dig into that a little bit more and going to different events, really just to kind of learn about it. I've been a consumer and an advocate of cannabis for a long time. And so once I learned that we had that program and just kind of getting involved in that way, just trying to learn more, I ended up meeting people who were very like-minded, and we noticed that the information wasn't being disseminated into our communities in the same way. So I live out actually in the south suburbs, but we would have to go way to the north side or way, in the northwest suburbs or wherever to these really homogenous events. And we noticed that there wasn't a lot of color there. We noticed that they weren't talking about cannabis in any way that any of us had ever heard. And so we got into this particular space, we decided to put together Chicago Normal. That was really how we founded that organization. And really, it was just from the standpoint of we just need to get people educated about the cannabis plant and the cannabis, the medical cannabis program. And, nobody is going to, if they don't see the benefits of cannabis or if they don't look at it as a medical thing, then, if they're not educated on that, nobody is going to be getting on this program. And that's what was happening. The patient, the patients on the program back in those days was dismal rates. And it just wasn't, but it's because a lot of people didn't know about it. And certainly people in Black and brown communities had no idea what was going on. So just getting into it from that standpoint, we decided to start Chicago Normal. We were totally naive. We just knew that we wanted to start a local chapter of this national thing, and that, we wanted to, first and foremost, just to educate, right? And we wanted to really do advocacy through education and outreach. So that's how I stumbled into it. Peter?
Yeah, good evening again. I've had the privilege of being able to do advocacy for actually most of my life. It started with like school-based advocacy. I have a number of family members with disabilities. And so that started really with like talking to principals and teachers about making sure that, they were being included and not discriminated or harmed in any way. And then that led to just like getting more, aware of systemic ills and just how this country is not a welcoming place really for most people. And then when I was in high school, I had a number of concussions from playing sports that totally changed my life. That led to like a series of different health conditions. Put me in a really terrible place for about 2 years. Was out of school for that whole time. Went down the whole like opioid kind of like over prescription route, just throwing things at the wall to see what would stick. And that ended up going way worse. And so I was 16 when I found cannabis, which was a little over 10 years ago. That just gave me like a very, a lot more direction in terms of like, wow, this country's healthcare system is not only horrible, but we're being denied, a medicine that humans have used collectively for tens, thousands of years. For medicinal purposes. And so from there, I've been able to just grow my advocacy. I'm originally from Detroit, in the Detroit area. I moved to Chicago in 2014. And so I've had the chance to be in Chicago for almost 10 years now and doing a lot of different advocacy from the city level, state level. And in 2019, I helped join the Cannabis Equity Coalition. When the town halls were happening about adult use legalization. There was the town halls just, talking about how great it was going to be. And, they were going to right all the wrongs and everyone was going to make generational wealth. And it was in those meetings that folks were asking questions and saying like, what's really going to happen? The state has done so many things wrong, and thinking about the lottery, thinking about all these other tax ploys that, we're going to pay you back now. And it's never come good. And so, that was almost 4 years ago. And so our coalition is now a full 501c3 and now a 501c4 as of this week, a 501c4 nonprofit. And so we do reentry services, record clearing services. We do know your rights education. We do a lot of policy research and advocacy to try and move this program in the direction it should be going. I'll pass it over to you, Shawnee.
So I ended up as a actual patient after being diagnosed with lupus, Sjogren's, and hypothyroidism. I got sick at 15 and had never consumed, and it took 10 years for a diagnosis. So at that point, at 25, I was willing to try anything. And so that's kind of how I ended up. And at the time I was living in California, where it was medicinal at the time. I had a friend who owned a dispensary, a medical dispensary, and I kind of got to see that process unfold. So after moving back home, my background is in business ops and staffing and recruiting and human resources. I had gone to a networking event June of 2019, and Saw a few men speak that, looked like me and basically said, don't go for a license, go for, what you're interested in, what you're good at, what you currently do. And that is how I entered the cannabis space, was listening to someone who was up there, trying to put me on game and tell me to avoid, a lottery ticket and to focus on, what I know best. So I've been in it since 2019.
Tricia, you want to pull something from our Q&A next? You're on.
Question was around cultivation licenses. So I'm going to reiterate what S.L. said previously. Like, if you have a license related question, you can send us a note on CannaTrep.com, and then we can answer that question specifically there. Go to our briefing, or you can come to, you can come to our webinar next week. We'll be talking about dispensary licensing. But I think the best one for this, because it's cultivation related, is to send us a brief advising request, and then we'll be able to respond to you on that. So the next question is, can you all name drop some Black people of color leaders in cannabis in Illinois? I can't talk. Can you all name drop some Black people of color leaders in cannabis in Illinois? Why you like their work and what they've done for people of color?
I mean, there's quite a bit of people. I don't even know where to start. Right? I mean, Kiana, Edie Moore of Chicago Normal, Douglas Kelly of Coalition, Ambrose Jackson, who has a grow license, Maurice, what is Reese Walton? He has a grow license. There's a ton of people that are making sure, like, they're giving back. They're trying to explain, like, some of the challenges that they had. Some of them, have grants and foundations. And J.R. Fleming, he's definitely a firecracker, but he
Michael
serves as
Self.
Michael. Yep, Michael Self.
Yeah.
She did one of our research reports.
That's like Tiffany Reynolds from Soul and Wellness.
Oh yeah, yep. She OG.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people.
I'm gonna throw some out there. I mean, besides this this entire group that we have on here today, and the work that all of us are doing in the space, but I'm also gonna throw out there Sam Owens and Danielle Parker, who are on this webinar with us. Sam Owens, my partner and husband, and Danielle Parker, one of our partners over at Law and the Fam, where we do restorative justice work through a program called Legit Pathways Academy. And we, similar to Shawnee and many other stakeholders, are focused on helping people find pathways into the industry.
I think the part about that that's hard to answer is because it seemed like they were looking for something very specific in terms of like, and what have they done for Black people and people of color in the industry. And the names that we named and so many other names that we can't even like think of, like anything that is in it that is for Black people, at least the seed of that thing came from some of them people that we named, right? And so learning more about the legislative process helps you to kind of understand that when we say the seed and the foundation, right, it's like we can give them the proposal that takes into consideration all of the people and all of the perspectives and all of the things from the street, like I always like to talk about from the street. But by the time it makes it to the actual law, it's been stepped on a few times. There's a couple, it's been taxed. Everybody got a tax to put on it. And when I say tax, I mean like the veterans want their piece and the police want their piece and the mental health people want a piece and the so and so. And so those are conversations and things that are happening that us as advocates are not privy to. that half the time we don't have any idea about until after it comes out and we're reading it and we're like, oh, well, you can see where that came from and where that came from. So it's really hard to quantify in a, it's not like a Rosa Parks thing. Like I can't say I refuse to go sit on the back of the bus and now we get to sit on the front of the bus, but I can say that I advocated for, for the community college program and for any number of the, things, legislative changes that have gone out since then, or that have been proposed since then, as well as those 3 lotteries that we just had. We did that, and that will eventually turn some people into some millionaires, or at least 100,000-aires.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one before I do another question? Tricia, before I was going to add a question before the Q&A if anybody else didn't want to jump in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that was a loaded question in the sense of like a lot of people doing a lot of things. And so if you want to get something more specific, like if you have questions about particular aspects of the space, like who's doing what in education and who's doing what, in terms of social equity associations or industry groups, or who's doing what in terms of different areas of licensing, that'll help us probably be able to flesh out more direct answers for that question. Because one thing about Illinois, especially if I'm comparing it to another state that I practiced in that's legalized, Colorado, is it's very unique in the sense that there are so many BIPOC people, like large and in charge, all right? And that is very different than other jurisdictions that I practiced in this space. Just by virtue of us being right here with you tonight is a testament to that.
I was gonna say, for the Black Cannabis Conference, Illinois was the deepest mob in the conference, like, and it wasn't even all of us. I would probably say it was like half of us, and they were like, dang, where all these Black people come from? Like, y'all all seem to know each other. It's like, yeah, we from Chicago.
And I just wanted to add to that. I think one of the things, and it was kind of implied in the question, is like, well, what have they done? The work continues. It's never stopping, right? So it's like, yes, people advocated for example, specific components of things. And then by the time it actually comes out of the legislature, it changed. And then you have to go back and advocate to say, well, this created this other problem. We got to backtrack and fix that. And so as long as it's legal, and as long as we have a legislature, and as long as there's going to be activity, there's always also going to be a need for advocacy and people continuing to step up and stand in the gap for all people of color, especially to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to continue to play in the space and get a fair shake.
Another question that I'll throw out there before we take another one from our Q&A is, and answering this as if like we all know absolutely nothing about legislative advocacy. How do you all approach setting goals and agendas and taking it? Like, can you guys walk us through some of like what it looks like just on the little couple of steps? Like, how do you get into it? How do you get into the thing?
Happy to jump in on that one. Yeah, so obviously we all have different goals, and it's really important that we all kind of understand like who's setting the goal and for what purpose. And so like collectively, we're all at the table here tonight. We're all here cannabis equity advocates and folks who want to see a more inclusive industry. We want to see repair paid. This is something like, so we want to make sure everybody's voice is heard, and that's kind of the first priority. And so we've at the coalition have some examples of doing this. So going back to 2021, we received a grant to do some policy research, and so we were able to start some working groups looking at. Well, first of all, we did a survey and we asked folks, what do you want to see change? What do you want to see updated in this industry? People talked about things like social consumption sites. People talked about things like consolidating the whole cannabis program into one agency. S.L. brought up earlier, there's a million different agencies all trying to do the same thing, but they don't actually work together. And so, making sure that we all kind of have our opportunity to talk about our goals and what we want to see, understanding micro goals versus macro goals. Like, we all want to see changes overnight that are going to take 2 to 3 to 5 to 10 years. We want to implement new changes. We want to get new licenses out there. And it's going to take a lot longer than we all want it to take. And so really making sure that we right size the goals for ourselves and with the resources that we have access to. Because that's the other thing is you have to understand, like, what are you actually able to commit to? How many people do you have? How much money do you have to spend? Because going down to Springfield is not free. Hiring a lobbyist is not free. And so all these things have to be kind of included in your conversations. And so you think about all the goals you want to set. Again, give yourself a realistic timeline. And once you have that timeline, again, thinking about then you get into your strategies and your tactics, thinking about how are you going to engage all the different stakeholders that need to be engaged, all of the politicians, but like S.L. mentioned earlier, all of the moneyed interests, all the lobbyists, whether that's the big cannabis corporations, whether that's groups like the Illinois Municipal League, who represent the cities of Illinois, or the groups who represent the counties, or the groups who represent the sheriffs or the chiefs of police. There's a million people down in Springfield, and it's important that you understand the landscape and who needs to be who needs to be massaged into the right decision. And so that is it's really a kind of a balancing act, but yeah, and I know that answer kind of meandered, but again, really trying to make sure you right size your goals, make sure everybody has a voice in setting goals. And then from there, just making sure you understand who's at that table, who are those stakeholders, who's going to get you what you want, or who's going to hold you back from getting what you want, and thinking about what leverage you can create to get everybody to be on your team.
Can I add that also understanding like where would the change come from? So S.L. gave that really great explanation at the beginning about how laws are made and how there's legislation, but there's also rules. And so really figuring out like, okay, is this something that can be changed in rules, or this is something that has to be changed in legislation? Helps you to get a more realistic understanding of the timeline that's involved. And that's very, very important to set those and manage those expectations, because you just don't want to put it out there like it's going to be like a super quick thing. And sometimes I feel like we have Peter and I work very closely together, and Shawnee, and so I think sometimes like we go into it thinking like, well, this is simple. They can just do this, and they could just do this, but that's not how it's done. So a lot of times I feel like it's in how you communicate it to the public as well is about setting those expectations of how those goals are prioritized and how much time it's going to take to really actually do it.
Any more additions before Tricia pulls from the Q&A? Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually going to add one more piece to that.
Okay.
It's about this issue specifically is a totally, because it's a brand new industry to the state. We have to educate everybody to a level that any other industry wouldn't have to face. So we are trying to work on regulating cars or schools or water. Like there's a system, there's a process. Everybody has a baseline kind of idea of what's going on. Because cannabis is so new, think about lawmakers as generalists. They might have 1 or 2 specialty topics that they know a lot about, but they don't know much about anything else. And so this issue, like, we have a very unique opportunity to educate them and to get them to understand the truth about, the war on drugs, the truth about, the way legalization has been set up, but also understanding that you have to knock down a ton of stigma to get there, which is much easier said than done.
Oh, I am unmuted. Okay, I had to double check. All right, so one of the questions in the Q&A box is, on more than one occasion. Those who are in place to help and serve people interested in entering the industry, for example, cannabis-friendly bank owners, purposely try to exclude, deter, and even give inaccurate information. Anybody want to address that?
So I was the one that asked Dorian for a little bit of elaboration because I wanted to make sure I understood the question correctly. And I was in that same, I had that same question, I would say fall of 2019, because I kept going to conferences and seeing like, you know, men that didn't come from my background telling a crowd full of people who looked like me that they shouldn't apply. And I was getting angry, like super, super angry. And then, you know, 1 year in cannabis is about 7 years. Okay. So I've spent about 21 years in cannabis at this point. And I can say that those warnings, or what you would see as like gatekeeping, is really, I think it's people who are really well informed, and I can't speak for everybody, but I think it comes from a good place where they're really trying to make sure people who are interested in having a plant touching business understand the challenges they're going to come up against. I have several clients, white, black, brown, that thought it would be one way, and it's, you know, taken years to get stood up and $10 million down the drain. And others who are just like, I'm not about to go through this, I'm going to sell my license. So it's more than what meets the eye. And I think some people just want folks who are coming from legacy, or folks who think they want a license, to understand that there are more opportunities. Like 67% of the industry doesn't have a license. 67% of the industry does stuff like what Tricia does, and what Kiana does, and technically what Peter does, and what I do. Not touching the plant at all, but still being able to make a living and pay bills in this industry. Hopefully that answered your question.
I'm going to add to that question too, because I've been as a first generation attorney and college graduate in my family, and first generation entrepreneur in my family. I will say that I've seen other competitive industries in addition to cannabis where I've experienced this same thing, this idea of like, so for example, before I struck out into entrepreneurship as a lawyer, I practiced a lot of franchise distribution and supply chain law. And the franchise bar, for example, in the country is like competitive like cannabis. It's like trying to get into that circle felt like, wait, hold on, wait a minute now. We want to keep all the McDonald's money. You know, we don't want to share any of these Burger King crap. You know, it really felt like that. And I would be like, I don't understand, like, you know, there's enough for everybody, you know, why can't we all, you know, share? And it really felt like every part of the institution, not like the franchise lawyers, the franchise associations, like it felt like at every level there was a lot of that. And I think that it can feel that way in the cannabis space as well. And so I don't think any of us could fully answer the motivations of excluders, because I wouldn't count anyone on this program to be an excluder. We all are coming together right now, you know, from different organizations. We're all collaborators. So it's very hard for a collaborator to speak for an excluder. But what I will say in terms of a tip for how to address being excluded is to probably, instead of focusing on the excluders, is in some ways almost just ignoring the excluders and putting all of your energy into finding the collaborators like those of us on this call, and finding your tribe of associates and organizations and partners who really do want to give you space and bring you into the fold. And then the second, I think, piece of really good, like on the legal side, advice about this market, and that's even whether you're coming from legacy or not, you're green, you know, from whatever vantage point, or even seasoned and just not familiar with the legalized aspects of it yet is to learn the vocabulary of it. And that's one of the things I did, for example, in franchise, when I noticed like, oh, it's a vernacular around here. There, and that begins to bring you into the fold often. So I was like, oh, I didn't understand, you know, everybody's walking around talking about Z's and Zors, which I eventually figured out means franchisees and franchise stores. And there's a language that brings you into the fold that lets people know, oh, you're in, you know our code languages, and on our website at TREP, we put together a glossary to help people get into the fold and understand what the language is that's used, the lingo that's used in the cannabis space, particularly here in Illinois. So that would just be a tip I would give.
Is in the Q&A. Want me to do a couple and then come back to you, or did you just still want to go back and forth?
Let's do another from the Q&A.
Okay. All right. So next question is, do you think that the black market cultivators should become legal? And if so, what are some ways or a few steps to get a cannabis card to actually grow?
Now, Dwayne, you know good and well that the term is not black market because you are in my grant program, sir. So we're gonna talk about it on Saturday. It's legacy, like the program legacy. And yes, I do think legacy market growers should consider it, but I also think it needs to be calculated. So I always tell people who wanna come from legacy and actually become legal and licensed is to think of it in phases. So like, for example, first phase, coming up under someone else, like whatever that looks like, partnering with someone else, collaborating with someone else, so you can understand like how the regulatory side of things works, because you're not used to regulations. And then, you know, second, third, fourth phase, thinking, okay, after I get this experience under someone else, now what do I want to do? Do I want to get my own license? Do I want to have a brand? What do I want to do? And looking at it from that perspective, instead of saying, oh, I just want to go shoot for the stars and see what happens.
It's good business advice in general. All right.
Go ahead, keep them coming from the.
Yep, I will move on to the next. The next question is there any advice for a lottery winner dispensary still in court? Haven't been abreast of any recent legislative updates in our favor.
I mean, Peter could probably speak better to this, but I don't know if you're already in court. I don't know that anything legislative that happens now affects that, because typically you're in court because of the legislation that had already existed, and so you're arguing, or whatever the case may be, right? You're arguing for your rights under that law that existed then. Things that are happening legislatively now are kind of being put in place to fix some of the things that was wrong with that, but I don't know, and some of it is born out of some of that, but I don't know that it fixes any of it. I don't know that it changes anything of it, because now you've kind of put your hands in the fate of the court, or your fate, I said that opposite, your fate in the hands of the court. And they're gonna do it based on what that law was at that time, not whatever little changes we make now.
Peter, I have something I can add to after you, if you have something.
No, you're good. I was going to echo everything that was said. Yeah, your lawyer is going to have the most up-to-date information about the court cases, and yeah, we're not going to, the new laws we do pass, they're most likely not going to change your case.
Mm-hmm. What I will add to that is definitely everything Kiana just said, and in addition to that, I'll add, it certainly, as she's pointing out, it wouldn't be probably related to anything that's in dispute in your court case right now. at least from what I've been seeing for proposals coming out right now, but they might be related to you as a license category holder, depending on which category of license you have. If you recall, if I go back on these slides, depending on your category, if you're in one of these 3 buckets, and even if you're in the infuser category, you may be seeing something come down the line on deferring fees and deferring taxes for your category of license. You may be seeing something that could be related to expanding your grow space, depending on your category of license. You may be seeing something related to being able to share spaces with other license holders. You may be seeing something related to THC set-asides if you're an infuser. And so certainly you could potentially see some things, but I don't think they necessarily may be related to your court case, but they may be related to your license category.
All right. Next question. Why do they make it so hard to get legal? I am not going to comment.
I love how everybody's like,
I mean, which
version
day?
of my answer do I
Right.
give? Am I Attorney Owens? Am I Grant Receiver Owens? Am I Hood Kid from the West Side Owens?
You probably can't be none of those people. You should just.
Right? Were you going to jump in there?
I mean, my answer is simple because it's a lot of money at stake and it's federally illegal and they ain't gonna make it easy. I mean, you know, with risk, there's reward, and that's really the long and the short of it. It depends on which day you're talking about. I mean, if they've made it, it's legal, you know, and you can get legal. You just got to be willing to jump through the hoops. And there's plenty of people that's willing to jump through the hoops and pay the money and do the things as they've been set out. So they really just don't care about those of us that can't, because there's enough people that can. And without a really good big groundswell of people who will do the work that Peter and Shawnee and I do, that will come and stand, you know how many times like Peter and them go to Springfield and they're like, well, where are the licensees? Well, where are the people? You know, if we're having and there's a big, you know, there's obvious answers for where the people are. They at work because they ain't got no money because they living their life and they don't have anything yet, but this promise of a license one day in the future, perhaps. But you know, if we're having a press conference or whatever, like it's hard for us to even get others to kind of join in the fight, and the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and we just don't squeak loud enough, and we don't grease enough if we being honest, because we don't have no money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it all comes down to money, and that's really the main thing that I'm going to say is it's all about money. Illinois is run by a very small handful of corporations, you know, whether it's ComEd, whether it's the Cresco Lab GTIs of the world, like every industry in the state of Illinois is we're consolidated down to a handful of companies. And that's the way that this country is going. That's the way the world is going. And like, they legalized it so they could make a quick buck, but this was never about making it inclusive. This was never about making it legal for everybody. S.L. said something earlier, like they created a series of regulations, and Kiana just said it. If you can jump through those hoops, that's great. You are on the regulated market, but it's still not legal. You can still leave a dispensary, get pulled over on the way home because you're driving with weed. Like it's still like a house of cards in my opinion. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a monopoly. It's not like they didn't try to hide, like the former Speaker of the House, Michael Madigan, like this dude is going to keep getting federally indicted and keep getting these charges because this man was running the state like his own little piggy bank for 50 years. Like this man, like if that was the guy who ushered in weed, like he didn't care about what was right or wrong. Like don't ever get that twisted. Like it's all about the
It's billions, y'all. It's billions of dollars at stake. All right?
Billions.
Billions at stake. And we live in a free market capitalist society, which makes things a competition. And so once you start having a competition and billions of dollars at stake, you are going to have difficulties in terms of getting into that space, monetizing that space, particularly if you already have the hurdles of having been impacted by the war on drugs.
So I just wanted to pop in for 2 seconds to kind of answer to the same question that you guys have been trying to answer to. And I want to come from the place of a federal employee that works for an agency that has nothing to do specifically with cannabis on my my 9-to-5 job, as the Trep school knows. And everything that is done, every industry has regulation, and each state has regulation. And what you'll see is it's no different in Illinois than any other state. That I've done legal research for S.L. about different states, and it's extremely similar as far as the difficulty entering the market. The nuance with Illinois is that it just happened to be the first state to introduce social equity. So to even broach the idea of, hey, we want to address the fact that the war on drugs impacted you in these neighborhoods and impacted people of color and so on. So it's the first state to try to broach it, and then try to say, we kind of sorry, and then try to legislate through their sorriness, but in a sort of way that doesn't always make sense or doesn't come out being the best, which is why you see continuous legislation occurring, why you see continuous rule changes in this 2 or so years in which it's been legal. But with what I do, I'm spitting facts from a legal standpoint on a daily basis about what the government is attempting to let individuals who are trying to access these services know. And it happens in no matter what market. And in this situation, it is a legal state situation, and you don't quite yet have a federal regulation that is pushing it in a certain direction. So one of the questions was, who are the Black people that have done the things, and what have they done for me lately? Is we are here. That is the thing that has been done. We are here, where you may not see that in other states. I just wanted to pop in and say that after all these wonderful people have said all they have said, and they are the subject matter experts. I am not. I'm just a person that gets to watch it all the time. So I just wanted to pop in and say that.
I'm also going to add that at the end of the day, in Illinois, what it's really about is tax dollars. That's what it's really about. That's why it's so hard to get legal, because they want your money.
I want to be like the DJs when they have like the little horns. I want one that does like the coins. I need that for the webinars moving forward. I'm going to figure that out on my phone.
Yep. I mean, that's really what it's all about, is the taxes.
Anything else popping in our Q&A? I want to just put a time check out there that is 7:40, and we typically wrap up on time at 8. So I just want to just put that time check out there for everybody.
All right, so the next question is, what policy or legislative change do you feel could have an immediate positive impact on equity in cannabis?
Okay, look, I'll add this, and this is where I will go back to my slide that said, I do not express the views of the state of Illinois. I am not lobbying for any position changes, okay? Because that's another thing on the educational tip for folks to understand trying to get into this space. One thing to think about regulatory wise, that is, if you are receiving funding from the state to put on certain programs, there are rules and regulations that curtail you being engaged in lobbying activities with those grant dollars. So that's something, a learning point for folks in terms of thinking about that from an educational standpoint. All right. So one thing that I think could be very helpful, speaking from advocacy and not lobbying, is it could be very helpful from an advocacy standpoint to see a fund that is strictly dedicated to direct reparations. Okay, that is a thing that I think could have an immediate impact in this state.
Definitely agree with that. On the cannabis side, we have a lot, as y'all probably know, we've been kind of stuck in, in the same place the last couple of years because our lawmakers haven't advanced any new laws. So we have a lot that needs to be pushed forward this year. S.L. talked about them at the top, but anything from like increasing the square footage that craft growers can grow so they can actually compete in this marketplace. There was 185 dispensaries came out last year. There's more coming out next month. Those folks need to buy weed somewhere. And so, we need to give the craft growers as much, opportunity to grow as possible so they can, support this market. So there's can actually be a healthy ecosystem where everybody's actually able to compete. The coalition, we're really, trying to push for things like social consumption because we have to, make sure folks have a place they can go that's not going to get that, because right now, unless you're a homeowner, you really can't legally smoke weed. That's unfortunate, but it's the law in Illinois. And so we can create, opportunities for people to start their own businesses, and with a much lower barrier to entry than a dispensary or a grow, we can get people into business and ultimately keep people safe, not get people evicted, not get people kicked out of public housing. So there's all these different things from, again, thinking about micro to macro. There's a lot that needs to change. We hope to push a ton of stuff this year. And it's not just cannabis, everything from, we've signed on to things like the Fully Free Coalition, trying to end permanent punishments, trying to pass things like voting in prison, trying to, make the reentry system actually, a real system and not just the, you're gone, like goodbye thing, like an actual system where people actually get support when they come home. So there's a lot that we plan to pass this year. And the last thing I'll say before I get off the soapbox is this is a non-election year for the state of Illinois. The city election obviously is next month, but for the state, there is not an election. And so our lawmakers feel like they can do more because it's not an election year. They don't feel as much pressure. And so it's really important that we seize the opportunity right now, because next year they're going to be a lot less open to doing adventurous bills or policies like the ones we want to pass.
Nobody else? If not, I'll move on to the next question. Okay, I'll move on. Next question is, I am a regulatory compliance attorney licensed in California and Illinois. To know what you see as the biggest compliance hurdles for licensees right now.
Did that say for current ones?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, sister. Does it say for current license holders?
It does. It just says for, I'm assuming yes, because it says
Okay.
Illinois licensees right now, so it have to be current license.
Okay, I was just clarifying. I think I saw Shawnee come off mute.
Yeah, I was gonna say some of the things that I've seen that have been a real cumbersome circumstance for some of the folks that are coming online is like if you think about it from a project management standpoint, certain things are can't be completed or can't even start until something else completes. And then other things aren't necessarily dependent on anything. And so, for example, when folks get their conditional, that means, all right, it's go time. Now it's time for you to, lock down your location if you already haven't. but it's also time for you to make sure your location has been zoned, that you do, everything you're supposed to do to make sure you have that special use permit. But at the same time, once you get all of that permit, you can't, you can't actually start construction, which I don't think that was foreseen for a lot of people. So you can't like touch your facility, even though you have this permit, until, depending on where your facility is, the state department that's going to be licensing you, so IDFPR, Department of Ag, Illinois State Police, and then like if it's the city of Chicago. And I think there might be another entity. So these 4 entities have to look at your blueprint and then say, all right, all 4 of us think it's fine. But if one of them says, we don't like this part, you have to redo it and then send it out to all 4 and get it all approved again. Like, it's a very cumbersome process. And what I've seen with a lot of people that are either up, really, there's not many of them that are operational. There's maybe like 1 or 2, and those, everyone else, it's just been like daunting. 8 months, 12 months, a year and a half. So that, and then I'm always going to say the badging situation, because it's nonsensical. So the badging situation probably doesn't have much to do with compliance from your perspective as an attorney representing these licensees, but like, technically speaking, depending on what your background looks like, you can't get a job in the cannabis space in Illinois. You can't be badged to be a grow agent or an infuser agent or a dispensary agent. Therefore, you can't even work under someone to get the proper knowledge and skills that you need to be on the legal side. So you're kind of like in this limbo purgatory situation. And even if a company wanted to really invest in that population that has been justice impacted, they can't, because the state won't allow them.
I would add, and this is something we see very up close at TREP these days, is with the folks coming online, is zoning and getting local approval, which is why at the top of my presentation, I made sure to point out, like, there's these 2 buckets. So now we're really focused on Illinois, but there's this other bucket of local municipality, and zoning was right at the top, because that's something that we're seeing people run into, is not being able to get approved. Just because cannabis is legal in the state, doesn't mean that local municipalities are big fans. Like any other state, Illinois is diverse from north to south, east to west, central, and population wise, value system wise, and every municipality has its own ways of doing zoning and approvals and permitting, and there's some tension around, like, okay, you get approved in one region called the BLS region, and now it's not like you could just up and move to a whole new region, like, can't get any local zoning, so here I am, I'll just move to where cannabis, maybe a more friendly cannabis culture, or whatnot. And so I would definitely point out zoning as a like major thing that I think we will continue to see flare up as people come before zoning boards and begin to face hardships.
I just want to add 1 or 2 quick things to that. One is zoning. To make it even more complicated, the city of Chicago actually has 2 zoning boards, the Zoning Board of Appeals and the Zoning Committee of the City Council. And it's important to know that the Zoning Board of Appeals runs cannabis and totally unrelated things. And so you'll be on a zoning meeting that literally will go for 12 hours. And there will be 2 dispensaries on the agenda, and then a hair salon, and then just a bunch of random home renovations. And you're just like, what was going on here? None of these people are cannabis experts or at all. And so that's a little bit of a wrinkle. And the other piece I just want to add is for the dispensaries. The last round, we mentioned the 185 licenses that came out last year. Those licenses are like basically kind of, I think Shawnee said it earlier, but they're conditional. So you don't actually have the license. It's on paper you have it, but it's not actually a real thing. And what's happened is because of COVID, and all the delays of the program and all the lawsuits, which led to further delays, the folks who got those licenses have been tied up for 2 years. The money's changed, the money's dried up. Investors have left the state, they've moved other places. Whatever the case is, people need more funding. the state is not going to allow those companies, because they've already been granted the conditional license, to bring on new principal officers. So you're not allowed to exchange equity. You're not allowed to take on, a cash infusion for equity. And so they're putting specifically the, 100 and I think it's 192 dispensaries in this position of like, if you, the plan that, that you wrote 3 years ago, that's still not perfectly intact. Like, again, the state, not saying they could have planned for a pandemic and stuff like that, but there are things in this process that it's like, how did we get here? Like,
Yeah, Peter just mentioned something I don't think you guys caught. Basically, if your principal officers have changed, for example, you brought someone on that wants to invest and take a few percentage points of equity, can't do that. Got to go all the way back.
Yeah, your principal officers can't change. So it's not if your principal officers have changed, your principal officers can't change.
I think we could probably do a whole session on like, where are the hurdles? Maybe we will at some point, just a whole, where are the hurdles? Tricia, I'm looking at the time and think that we should make that one our last question and wrap up.
Okay. So the last question is, why did the government, lie about the social equity as far as helping the impoverished areas, but they really made it for people with money who don't care about cannabis?
Can I speak to that?
Go ahead, Keon.
Social equity is a term that existed long before now in a lot of other realms. And it has become, because of the cannabis industry, it has become a buzzword and a really great word, but it has a definition in the world, it has a definition in cannabis, and it has a definition in Illinois law. And sometimes that lines up and sometimes it doesn't. In terms of, ask me the question again, why did they lie about what you say?
About the social equity as far as helping the impoverished areas, but they really made it for people with money who don't care about cannabis.
Oh no, they do care about cannabis. They care about cannabis as it relates to them making money. So the thing of it is, it would be very, I'm gonna be really honest, it would be very difficult for the people that we really consider to be, or that we would really look at as true social equity, to do this successfully at all. If you think about someone, if you think about like those who are impoverished, or if you live in impoverished communities, there is a lot of times, right? There is a whole context that's missing for those people in terms of raising money, managing money, running a business, being compliant with, like, there's all these different nuances that even if they really, really cared, they couldn't care enough to give us all of what we need to really repair the damage done by the war on drugs. So I think it's important for people to just be like super realistic about what social equity means. Illinois, remember when I talked earlier about this, like we plant the seeds and we lay the foundation and we have an intention behind it when we did it. So when we introduced the concept of social equity into the writing of that law, we had some specific things in mind, but they passed that law not because they necessarily cared about what we had in mind for social equity. They passed it so that they could be able to say, we have the most progressive social equity policy. We are the first state to pass cannabis with social equity in the law. Like, those are big kudos and big celebration points for people that care about that kind of stuff. But I don't know, now I'm probably just rambling and ranting and I don't even know if I'm answering the question, but they lie because they can, and they do, and they have to.
Well, I think it was a way I was going to say, I think it was a way to satisfy the advocates that were like, yeah, y'all not passing this bill unless there's some form of equity. But at the same time, I don't think anyone foresaw the barriers. And so there's educational barriers, there's economic barrier. There's a lot of different things that are in the way of, say, a person that comes from a disproportionately impacted area that really is committed to, you know, trying to get a license and actually keeping the license and cultivating the business and, you know, creating generational wealth. There's a lot of barriers that no one really could foresee, to be
And it's
completely
not
honest.
just money. It's
Yeah,
not
it's
just
so
money.
many things. I mean, most folks living in disproportionately impacted areas are just trying to survive. And there's so many other like layers of problems, systemic problems that just make it impossible. Not impossible, but very difficult.
It would have been impossible to write a law that actually did what all
What you
it
want
needed
it
to
to
do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think that's inherent in what Shawnee just said was the phrase unintended consequences. Like there are things that they have happen, and then in the execution of what they wanted to have happen resulted sometimes, and happens a lot, right? Resulted in unintended consequences that nobody could foresee.
I think that's another one that could be its own topic. To bring it full circle to today's topic, what I would say is that's exactly why we're here today, is to continue to give people the tools to get involved in the legislative advocacy process, because there is so much work to do, and because it is like whack-a-mole. Every time you hit one thing, another thing pops up, and here we are all trying to like hop on the next next thing. And so the more advocates join us in the advocate community and are educated on advocacy and know how to get involved and can get involved in the rulemaking process, the more we can begin to shape, as Kiana is saying, that legal definition of social equity in our state. And so I would like to thank all of our panelists who really did us a solid by bringing their experience being out in these streets, in these advocacy streets, these legislative advocacy streets. Thank you all for giving us your time and your talents tonight. We really appreciate you. I'd like to thank my sister Tricia over there, the moderator, but also just the most kindest, sweetest queen who creates opportunities for everyone everywhere she goes. She never leaves a room without leaving an opportunity. So thank you, sister. And thank all of you for joining us. And the last thing I would share is our CannaTrep website, where you can find a bunch of resources, including signing up for our upcoming webinars. We have some webinars coming up in February related to the new dispensary license application process, including one next Thursday night. We have previous webinar recordings, including this one that'll be uploaded there. We have our brief advising program where you can submit questions to us that you have, and we will answer those questions. We will research and answer. And then we have our individual consulting program, which right now is only open to individuals who have conditional licenses. And so we want to support you. We want to continue to be involved in helping people move forward. And I hope to see some of you all next Thursday. That's all I have, and I'll pass it back to Tricia.
So yes, I don't have anything to add. Just thank you, S.L. and the TREP team for doing all of the heavy lifting. I just show up. And thank you again to our panelists, because this has been a great session. Thank you to our attendees for coming out. I hope you left us some positive feedback, but please make sure you respond to our surveys. And we will see everyone next week. Oh, somebody just typed something in the Q&A. That always happens. Oh, it says thank you for a great webinar. You're very welcome. So thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Yes.